Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? If you have your Bible, turn to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. Title of the lesson tonight is The Curse of the Mummy. And probably that's not the best title. It's more like The Curse of the Egyptians. But who were the pharaohs that are mentioned in Exodus? And what could this curse possibly have been? So let's start reading in Exodus chapter 1. We'll start down in verse 6. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king of Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. They built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake unto the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. I don't know if you've ever read much about King Tut. I read an article about King Tut recently. His full name was Tutankhamun. And King Tutankhamun was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. And there's some intriguing things about King Tut. In 1922, there was an archaeologist named Howard Carter, and he led an expedition that found the tomb of King Tut. And they unearthed this mummy of King Tut. They took him out of his tomb, and when it was opened, right after that, Carter's pet canary was bitten by a cobra. Okay, that was pretty bad. A year later, Lord Cameron, the man that had financed this expedition, cut himself shaving and died from an infection. Well, then there was this legend that there was this curse associated with the mummy of King Tut. And because of that, the news started spreading all these different things that happened. By 1935, they said that there were 21 people who had died because of the curse of this mummy. Now, they really had to stretch that, because out of those 21 people that died, only 6 of them were actually involved in the expedition, and some of them died from natural causes and other things that could be explained. So 6 out of 22 people that were involved in this expedition wasn't really all that great a number, but because of the mummy's curse and all the interest that it generated, Hollywood took notice. And from 1935 until now, there have been over 500 movies that have been made with the curse of the mummy. And you may have seen some of these that featured these mummies coming out of the tomb, coming out of the casket, and wreaking wrath on the foolish mortals that had dared disturb their sleep. The story of King Tut is interesting. Now, it's interesting for several reasons, because maybe there really was a curse that was associated with this family. But it didn't affect the people that opened his tomb, and it didn't affect King Tut himself. Okay, before we get to that, for most historians, the Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus, they believe was Ramses II. And for generations, historians have taught that Ramses was the Pharaoh that was involved in the Exodus. But some more conservative historians have decided that maybe those dates were off by a couple hundred years. And maybe there was a curse that was associated with Tut's family, and it affected his father and his uncle and his grandfather. Now, according to history, King Tut's mother was named Nefertiti. And Nefertiti was famous because she was one of the most beautiful women that had ever lived. And his father was a pharaoh that was named Amenhotep IV. Now, Amenhotep IV wasn't necessarily as famous. In fact, we don't know as much about him as we do about King Tut. But he caused quite a stir back in his time because he decided that Egypt should only have one God. Before that, they were polytheistic. There were many gods. They worshiped the god of the sun. They worshiped the god of the river Nile. They worshiped frog gods and fly gods and all these other gods. But when Amenhotep came over, he decided that they only needed to worship one God. And scholars were divided as why he would make this change, but it wasn't really popular at the time. People don't like it when you change their religion. People don't like it today. They didn't like it back then. And it was so unpopular that when King Tut became king, he took over, one of the first things he did was go back to worshiping lots of gods. So King Tut was the one that went back to polytheism, or the worship of many gods. Now, let's go back and look at history. Amenhotep IV, King Tut's father, was the heretic king. He was the one that decided there should only be one God. And that was worthy of interest. But even more interesting is that Amenhotep IV wasn't really supposed to be the Pharaoh, because he wasn't the firstborn son. The firstborn son of the Pharaoh was supposed to be king, and Amenhotep was the secondborn son. The firstborn son of Pharaoh was a man named Thutmose. And Thutmose should have been the king, but he died mysteriously. And historians don't know why the firstborn child of Pharaoh died. It's getting interesting now. You're thinking maybe there's something else going on here. Sounds like their family may have suffered from a curse. But this curse would have been the curse that we know as the 10th plague that fell upon Egypt. God told Moses in Exodus chapter 4, starting in verse 22, "Thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." Now, before we go on, this is not confirmed history. There's still lots of disagreements about who the pharaohs were. But it just seems that this might work out, that King Tut's father, Amenhotep IV, was the second-born son, and he became pharaoh because his older brother died of mysterious causes. And once he became pharaoh, one of the first things he did was to change the worship of many gods to worshiping just one God. My guess is that Amenhotep was probably the second-born son of the pharaoh that defied God. He was the son of the pharaoh that was ruling during the Exodus. And I think probably he saw the failure of all the gods of his father. Think about it. The 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt, each of them was identified with one of the false gods of Egypt. The Egyptian people worshiped the Nile River. And the first thing that happened was the Nile River turned to blood. They had a frog god, and frogs plagued the land. They had fly gods, and the flies plagued the land. They worshiped the sun, and darkness plagued the land. All of these plagues attacked one of the Egyptian gods, and it just could be that Amenhotep IV says, well, all these gods didn't have any power. We need to have just one God. Now, his God probably wasn't the God of the Bible, but he saw that Moses' one God was more powerful than all his many gods, so maybe he would go to worshiping just one God too. If that's true, then his father, Amenhotep III, was the ruler during the Exodus. Now, he was a powerful ruler. Amenhotep III ruled for nearly 40 years, and he had one of the most prosperous and stable periods in Egyptian history. He built lots of things, and yet he suffered from a curse because his first son died mysteriously. So Amenhotep the third was the ruler during the Exodus. His son Amenhotep the fourth went to one god. His son King Tut went back to many gods. But there's still one Pharaoh we haven't identified. And that was the one we read about in our scripture. Who was the Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph? Well, Moses came back to Egypt when he was about 80. So the Pharaoh that was the father of the Egyptian woman that had raised Moses in the palace would have died, but most historians agree that King Tut's great-great-grandfather would have been Thutmose III. Thutmose III loved to build things. He built great monuments and temples. According to Wikipedia, he built over 50 temples, including what are the ruins of Karnak that are still being explored today. But that kind of building required lots of labor. And there were a lot of slaves that were involved in that labor. In addition, Thutmose III hated people that weren't like the Egyptians. Because years before Thutmose became king, Egypt had been taken over by some people called the Hyksos. Now the Hyksos had come in as a foreign power and they'd become the rulers in Egypt. A lot of people think that when Joseph arrived in Egypt that the Hyksos were in power. Now, it took a long time, but the Egyptians overthrew the Hyksos and ran them out of Egypt, but they didn't like them because they lived differently and they ate differently and they worshiped differently. And because of that, they didn't trust them. And so during their reign, the Egyptians weren't in charge anymore, and they got rid of all these Hyksos. But when the Egyptians took over again, the Israelites were still there. And it could be that they were identified with the Hyksos. They were in thick with them. They were the ones that invited the Israelites into the land to start with. And the Israelites didn't live like the Egyptians. And they didn't eat like the Egyptians. And they didn't worship like the Egyptians. And they were associated with these other people. And so maybe they decided that they needed to get rid of the Israelites too. Now, like I said, that's not confirmed history. We don't know for sure that that's exactly how it happened. So why are we talking about any of this anyway? Well, it makes a difference because there are a lot of people out there, so-called scholars, that want us to think that the Bible is not reliable, that it's historically inaccurate. For example, they don't think Moses showed up till 200 years later than this. They say that Amenhotep IV was worshiping only one God, that Moses, who was from a polytheistic people, all these people have lots of gods. Moses came into Egypt and met this king, and he decided, yeah, worshiping one God's a good idea, that he got the idea from Moses instead of Moses getting it the other way around. That Moses got the idea from this king, or rather, instead of the king getting it from Moses. And they believe that because they don't believe in the God of the Bible. They believe that religion evolved, that first people worshiped lots of gods, and then they started worshiping one God, and the God that we worship was just some God that we made up. They don't really believe he exists, but we know that there is a real God, and that the God in the Bible doesn't make errors in telling history. Now, the Bible wasn't given to us as a history book, but any historical facts that are in the Bible are accurate, and archaeologists over the last 100 years have discovered places and things that were mentioned in the Bible that they didn't know anything about, but they found them by reading the Bible and understanding what the Bible said about these places. And there's no other religious book that has the same kind of accuracy. God didn't give us the Bible as a history book, but it is historically accurate. And not only did God give us the Bible, but he left crumbs in history that kind of defend or explain the Bible, and part of that may have been King Tut and his grandfather and his father. Now, let's shift gears here just a little bit. I think the real curse upon the Egyptians wasn't the curse of King Tut. It was the curse of his grandfather and his uncle and his father, and it was God's judgment upon Pharaoh and Pharaoh's house, because ever since the rule of Thutmose III, Egypt had been at war with God. Remember, Pharaoh had made the Israelites slaves. Pharaoh had ordered that the Israelite children be put to death, thrown into the river, and God decided that it was time to free his people and to bring judgment upon all of Egypt, especially on the house of Pharaoh. Look at Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Moses came into Pharaoh and he said, the Lord says, let my people go that they may worship me. Look at Pharaoh's answer in Exodus 5 verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Pharaoh says, why do I care what your God says? I don't believe in your God. I don't know your God. Your God isn't anything to me. Who does that remind you of? Look at Isaiah chapter 14. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Isaiah chapter 14, we're told the thoughts that Satan had in his heart. Isaiah 14 verse 13, Satan saying, I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Satan is saying, I don't know God. I'm going to be God. Just like Pharaoh says, I don't know God. Your God doesn't mean anything to me. It just could be that Pharaoh is a type for Satan. Let's look at the example. Pharaoh, he held God's people in slavery. Pharaoh was known for his cruelty, and death and pain and punishment were in his hands. He owned God's people. Because when Moses came to him, he had to ask permission to take the people away from Pharaoh. Think about Satan. Satan, before we became Christians, held us in slavery. Satan's known for his cruelty, pain and punishment and death are in his hands. And he owned us because of our sins until Jesus bought us back. Look at Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1 chapter 1 verse 18 says that Jesus was the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Jesus was the firstborn from the dead. Through his resurrection, he broke down the gates of hell and took us away from Satan. He set us free from bondage, just like Moses set the people free from Egyptian bondage by the firstborn being killed. Also, the death of God's only begotten Son, his firstborn, purchased our freedom. Every time we see someone accept Jesus Christ and be buried in the waters of baptism, we remember the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus that purchased our freedom. One last thought. It's always bothered me that when the children of Israel were out in the wilderness, they're wandering. Every time they came upon a problem, what did they want to do? They wanted to go back to Egypt. They forgot about the pain. They forgot about the suffering. They forgot about the death. They forgot about the cruelty of Pharaoh. They remembered only the good things. Look at Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites were tired of eating manna. In verse 5, they said, we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. They'd forgotten the bitterness of slavery. They just remembered the good things that happened back in Egypt. I think sometimes that happens to Christians as well. They get bored of living a Christian life. They come across some trials and they say, you know, things were easier when we didn't have to worry about this church thing, when we didn't have to worry about being a Christian, when we didn't have to worry about setting examples. We had it better back then, and they forget that they were in bondage and that they were sentenced to death. And some even return to Egypt. They even go back into their old way of life. When Howard Carter and his associates found King Tut's body, they opened the casket. Guess what they found? There was another casket inside. They opened that second casket and they found a third casket. And they opened the third casket and there was a fourth casket inside, and it was made of solid gold. And they opened that gold casket and they found the mummy, and they unwrapped it and they found the body of King Tut. It was leathery and shriveled, because it didn't matter how elaborate the caskets, it didn't matter how fancy the wrappings were, it didn't matter how much effort the Egyptians took to preserve the bodies, they couldn't escape the final curse. The curse was death. But through Jesus, we've escaped that curse. We don't live in bondage anymore. We've been set free. Look at Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews 2, beginning in verse 14, says this. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. Jesus died to destroy the one that had the power of death. He died to defeat Satan. He died and was buried and rose again to set us free from the curse of the bondage of death. And that's why you need to be a Christian. It's the only life worth living, the only death one would dare to die. Everyone here tonight's already a Christian, but maybe sometimes we get tempted to go back into our old way of living. We remember the good things, the things that we're missing. We turn back. We want to go back to bondage. We need to remember that Jesus died to set us free. We need to rejoice in the fact that we have a new life and that we don't have to live that way anymore. If you're struggling in your new life and you need some help tonight, if there's anything we can do for you, if we can pray with you and for you, I want you to come forward right now. We stand together as we sing.